Leftist agendas rear their ugly heads, Pence shows us his angry side, and Reagan shows us how to unite. I'm Josiah Everton, and this is The Glorious Rescue.
Aren't you tired of feeling forced to choose between staying informed and being indoctrinated? Listen to the condensed news cycle without the lies, agendas, and confusion from the mainstream media, all while engaging in deeper discussions about the principles that have influenced our great nation. This is what rescuing America looks like. This is The Glorious Rescue.
Welcome back to another episode of The Glorious Rescue. I have to apologize because last episode we ended a little discouraged. It was a downtrodden episode. It was probably one of the more discouraging episodes, and not because I try to be, but just because I think the news cycle was. It was a sad day in American politics where political dialogue has disintegrated so much, and political emotion and outrage over politics has become so polarizing and so frustrating and emotional for so many people that we have outbreaks like that. And it is unfortunate and discouraging, but today I have a much better episode planned for all of us. We're going to spend less time in the current events, just keep you up to date on a few items before jumping into a more unifying end of show segment, something more encouraging. And so with that, we're going to move right into our very first story, and that is big tech. I'm not going to say much on big tech in general because you can reference episode 42, just 20 episodes or so ago. It's pretty crazy that we've come so far since then. It feels like it was not that previous, I should say, but episode 42. And I talk a lot about big tech, and that kind of gives you what I believe is the appropriate view of big tech, what I do believe about big tech, the idea that these are private companies. And this is where I disagree with a lot of conservatives that we're seeing in modern conservatives. Is that you have on the left, I'm backwards here, I'm reversed, I should say, so I got to make sure I'm right for you guys. On the left hand, you have liberal, right, you have conservative, and then on the upper and lower scale, you have authoritarian and libertarian, and I always fall more on the idea of right, obviously, but libertarian. Or I don't remember if libertarian's on the upper side or on the lower side, but we'll just, for sake of illustration, libertarian is lower, authoritarian is upper. And if you're listening and not watching, this might not make as much sense, but think of it like a quadrant, like a cross. And you can be on 4 different segments of that cross, if that makes sense. Right, up, left, down. And so libertarian means less government intervention, right? Obviously conservative policies, left, liberal policies. Authoritarian, more government control and enforcement of those policies, and libertarian, less. So you can be conservative and authoritarian. You could believe in these right principles, but believe that government should enforce them. And so with that, that's where you find a lot of people falling on, as far as conservatives falling in regards to the big tech sector and that debate. They believe the more conservative principle of free speech and big tech shouldn't be censoring, and obviously don't want, and why I'm saying this is because Donald Trump has been banned on Twitter and has been permanently suspended on Facebook, Instagram, and all that. But then when it comes to conservatives, yes, they believe in free speech. Yes, they believe in maybe private business and less government intervention of private business. And they want Donald Trump to have his free speech, and they want all of us to have free speech. But then when these big tech companies do crack down on Donald Trump, and wrongfully so, and I mentioned that in episode 42, they then want government to restrict businesses and force businesses to keep it open. And that's where I disagree. That's not the side that I fall under. Again, that is more right, but that is more, when I say right, I mean conservative, but it's more authoritarian. I fall on the right, but libertarian, that private companies should do what they want. I disagree with it 100%. I believe that political dialogue and discussion ought to be free in our country, and it's beneficial for people to exchange ideas, and I benefit from you and you benefit from me, debates, all of that, right? And that's something that we all wholeheartedly agree on, I think, as far as conservatives in general. But where we start to disagree is whether or not the government should come in and start regulating these businesses because the businesses are restricting free speech of people that we want. And I will give these conservatives the benefit of the doubt that if this were happening to liberals, that they wouldn't agree with it as well. So it's not necessarily hypocritical, but again, it's more authoritarian. And a lot of conservatives like that and with that mentality do so in regards to economics as well. So you have companies, or like Tucker Carlson is a good example of this, but the idea of not free trade, but putting tariffs on international goods so that American goods can boost, the idea of big government bailouts of long-term companies and things like that. They tend to side on those because, well, they're pro-American business, or these businesses have lasted for a long time, and so they're pro-government bailouts of that. Stimulus checks was another one. They wanted big stimulus checks. And I did say on the show that if we are going to send stimulus packages out, then it needs to go to the American people in the avenue of stimulus checks. But as far as the concept of just printing more money or giving more money out, I disagree with. And so, again, that would be another area where I would generally disagree with conservatives, the idea of just big government bailouts and protection of American businesses. So, with that, more authoritarian. Again, what Facebook is doing is wrong. What Twitter's doing is wrong. Instagram as well. It's wrong that the current sitting president, it's wrong, I think, for any social media platform to start filtering content. And that's the only really thing, the argument I can make of for government intervention in private business is the idea that these companies are labeled as social media platforms and yet they are filtering content or removing content. And so with that, they are technically a media company. That's what they are. And so they should be labeled that, they should be taxed that, they should be treated and regulated as such by the government. That's the only really government intervention I really see as being viable, or the argument that I could see as making sense. So now to take a deep breath from all that, I know it was a little bit lengthier than I planned, but with that, I would just recommend that's a brief overview going back to episode 42 if you want more of a comprehensive view of that. And the reason why I discuss this is because you have big tech censoring Donald Trump and removing a current sitting president on a social media platform because you disagree with him politically. So again, that is a scary precedent to set, of course. You have Pence, just to give you just a brief rundown of the headlines before moving into a lengthier end of show segment. We have we do have Pence being reported by a GOP senator that he was furious because of what Donald Trump was saying, obviously just the past few days ago. You have Pence furious. You did have Trump come back and acknowledge the election defeat, not necessarily conceding, but being more peaceful and all that, which I do recommend, or I am grateful for that the president did do. But again, you can go back to the last episode to see how I was very heated about and had some strong words to say about President Trump because of what he did say. You have a lot of rumors flying. I don't want to necessarily say quote unquote conspiracy theories. I'm not trying to give a derogatory term, but you have a lot of theories coming out. For instance, people grabbing laptops of like Pelosi and things while there was those raids. You have some people saying it was people. You have some saying it was special forces. You got a lot of rumors flying around to which I don't comment on because there's not enough evidence to suggest any of it. So with that, I just generally, I like to do so. I get interested in it. But at the end of the day, Joe Biden is set for his inauguration in mid-January, right? And so I don't give any credence to those types of conspiracy theories. And I will call them that. Sure, maybe there's evidence to suggest whatever. But you can always find evidence to suggest it once you already have your bias of what it should be. You can always go and find evidence to prove what you are looking for rather than letting the evidence show what you believe. So I will dismiss them. And again, if more information comes out on that, more credence is given to it, then we'll talk about it on the show. And you can say, Josiah, you're wrong, gotcha. And there we go. We can proceed after that. You do have more situations like Joe Biden doing a lot of race baiting, a lot of divisive talking, saying that if these individuals were BLM riots at the Capitol Hill, you would have had a much different take by the Capitol Police. And I disagree with that 100%. It's divisive. It's wrong. And go ahead and look back a few months ago where you had people rioting, looting. You had people lighting fire to large blocks. You had people setting up their own autonomous zones, government-free zones in their own cities within cities. And you had mayors and people doing absolutely nothing. Then you have an unarmed woman at Capitol Hill, and the police shot her and killed her. And again, go back to the last episode where I went all in very deeply against those rioters and the mob at Capitol Hill. I'm not supporting that whatsoever. Go back to last episode for a lot more context. But what I am saying is they weren't treated any differently. And then on the other hand, you have BLM rioters, looters, raiders going around and were let loose to do so, basically. I remember getting Amber Alerts on my cell phone telling me that I was curfewed and not allowed to go outdoors because there were rioters, and they let them, lawless citizens, go out and do whatever they wanted and take whatever they wanted and force law-abiding citizens like me to stay indoors. So no, it's not true. There wasn't any difference. If there were any difference, it was that they were stricter on this mob than they were the previous mobs in the last several months of rioting and lootings. But no difference there. So just wanted to acknowledge that as well. Let you know what's going on with social media, with big tech, what my take is on it. And again, more context in last episode for the riots at Capitol Hill, more context on episode 42 in regards to big tech and all of that. Really briefly, just to state what I was talking about, the agenda being let loose and us finally seeing the agenda of the left. This is what I'm referring to, and that is you have many reporters, many members of very far-fetching left, radical left media companies saying that there's not enough censorship, and that's really the true agenda that's being shown here. That's what they want of big tech. what I am hearing being stated by a lot of conservative talk show hosts and really smart people that I do agree with, and that is that they believe that these companies, Facebook and Twitter, they are censoring or just banning Trump in general because we have a Democratic House, Senate, and President now, really control of power by the Democrats moving forward for the next couple of years. And they don't want to see big censorship crackdowns and huge corporate taxes and corporation regulations coming for the next several years from the Democrats. And so they're doing this to appease them. And I think that's very viable. It's very possible that these companies, Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey and all these CEOs are doing so because they look at the next couple of years of Democratic control and see the huge regulation that will come from them and believe that that the way to avoid that, the way to appease them, is to ban Donald Trump. Now, with that, we're going to move right into our end of show segment of Teach the Speech. Welcome back to another segment of Teach the Speech. This is probably a listener favorite. And so with that, we're going to get into Ronald Reagan's first inaugural address. And you might be thinking, haven't we covered this before? We have barely. We covered just the very end of this, maybe the last 2 paragraphs or so of the speech. Mentioned it in an end of show segment of Teach the Speech. I think we even played the video. I think that's what it was, and commented on it. But I want to give a more general overview of the whole speech because there was so much missing from the last time we covered it, that I want to give a more in-depth or a more overview, I should say at least, rather than just talking about the last 2 minutes of the speech or whatever it was. So I'm going to just briefly kind of go point by point. Some sections are paragraphs. He doesn't necessarily start off, but early on in the speech, he says, "To a few of us here today, this is a solemn and most momentous occasion, and yet, in the history of our nation, it is a commonplace occurrence." Later, he says, "In the eyes of many in the world, this every 4-year ceremony we accept as normal is nothing less than a miracle." What he's referring to is the idea of having democratic elections where we, the people, can consent to the governed. What should be allowed, who should be allowed to rule, is a miracle to many, and yet so normal to us. He goes on and basically talking about maintaining the continuity of our political system is the bulwark of our republic. He goes on to say, "The business of our nation goes forward. These United States are confronted with an economic affliction of great proportions." He then explains what those are: sustained inflations that threaten to shatter the lives of millions of our people. He talks about idle industries that have cast workers into unemployment, causing human misery and personal indignity. Those who do work are denied a fair return for their labor by a tax system which penalizes successful achievement and keeps us from maintaining full productivity. A lot of his speech actually is economic in scope. But great as our tax burden is, it has not kept pace with public spending. For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future for the temporary convenience of the president. It's very interesting because Ronald Reagan wasn't so great for the deficit, as it turns out. He didn't do so great for the debt or the deficit. But he does talk about the idea of mortgaging the president on the altar of our children's future. You and I as individuals can, by borrowing, live beyond our means, but only for a limited period of time. Why then should we think that collectively as a nation we are not bound by that same limitation? We must act today in order to preserve tomorrow. And let there be no misunderstanding, we are going to begin to act, beginning today. In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. From time to time, we have been tempted to believe that society has become too complex to be managed by self-rule, that government by an elite group is superior to government for by and of the people. But if no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else? All of us together in and out of government must bear the burden. The solutions we seek must be equitable, with no one group singled out to pay a higher price. That's very important. The idea of self-rule, self-government that we talk often on the show. But if he says if the whole idea of elitist government, of bureaucracy, is totally askewed because you believe that elitists have to run the common man because the common man is not smart enough. But if mankind is not smart enough to rule itself, then why in the world is mankind smart enough to rule other people? And Ronald Reagan is exactly right. He goes on, "We hear much of special interest groups. Our concern must be for a single special interest group that has been too long rejected. They are, in short, we the people, this breed called Americans." He goes on later, "So as we begin, let us take inventory. We are a nation that has a government, not the other way around. And this makes us special among the nations of the earth. Our government has no power except that granted it by the people. It is time to check and reverse the growth of government which shows signs of having grown beyond the consent of the governed. It is my intention to curb the size of the federal government. All of us need to be reminded that the federal government did not create the states. The states created the federal government." And the rest of the speech is quite lengthy that unfortunately we don't have time to get too far into. But he says, now so there will be no misunderstanding, it is not my intention to do away with government. It is rather to make it work with us, not over us. To stand by our side, not ride on our back. Government can and must provide opportunity, not smother it. Foster productivity, not stifle it. If we look to answer as to why for so many years we achieved so much, prospered as no other people on earth, it was because here in this land, we unleashed the energy and the individual genius of man to a greater extent than has ever been done before. Freedom and the dignity of the individual have been more available and assured here than in any other place on earth. The price for this freedom at times has been high, but we have never been unwilling to pay that price. He talks about how the only reason why we have further troubles is because as our troubles grow, it is to that same extent and proportionate to that same extent that we allow government to grow. He says it is time for us to realize that we are too great a nation to limit ourselves to small dreams. We are not, as some would have us believe, doomed to an inevitable decline. I do not believe in a fate that will fall on us no matter what we do. I do believe in a fate that will fall on us if we do nothing. So with all the creative energy at our command, let us begin an era of national renewal. Let us renew our determination, our courage, and our strength, and let us renew our faith and our hope. We have every right to dream heroic dreams. Those who say that we are in a time when there are no heroes just don't know where to look. You can see heroes every day, going in and out of factory gates. Others, a handful in number, produce enough food to feed all of us and then the world beyond. You meet heroes across a counter, and they are on both sides of that counter. There are entrepreneurs with faith in themselves and in faith in an idea who create new jobs, new wealth, and opportunity. There are individuals and families whose taxes support the government and whose voluntary gifts support church, charity, culture, art, and education. Their patriotism is quiet, but deep. Their values sustain our national life. I have used the words they and their in speaking of these heroes. I could say you and your because I'm addressing the heroes of whom I speak. You, the citizens of this blessed land. Your dreams, your hopes, your goals are going to be the dreams, the hopes, and the goals of this administration, so help me God. Can we solve the problems confronting us? Well, the answer is an unequivocal and emphatic yes. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, I did not take the oath I have just taken with the intention of presiding over the dissolution of the world's strongest economy. I didn't take oath under the assumption that it was for nothing, that America was going to go to waste anyways. I don't have time to get to some of the best portions of the speech, but he says it is time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means and to lighten our punitive tax burden. And these will be our first priorities, and on these principles, there will be no compromise. That's the economic portion. He goes on and gives some more, talking about how we're all worthy of being called those heroes, patriots who sacrifice day in and day out for our country. He talks about our neighbors and our allies who have that same love for freedom, how we will support them and stand behind them, but for the enemies of those freedom, they will be reminded that peace is the highest aspiration of the American people. We will negotiate for it, sacrifice for it. We will not surrender for it, now or ever. He then goes on talking about how this is the first time that the inauguration address has happened at this specific point. And when he does so, after he talks about it, he talks about all the different memorials, the Washington Memorial that they look at, the Lincoln, the Jefferson, and how those men, those great men of stature and men of character, men of wisdom, have given us the opportunity to live in this land and celebrate that ceremony of the inauguration. He mentions Arlington National Cemetery with its row on row of simple white markers bearing crosses or stars of David. They add up to only a tiny fraction of the price that has been paid for our freedom. Each one of those markers is a monument to the kinds of hero I spoke of earlier. Their lives ended in places like Belleau Wood, the Argonne, Omaha Beach, Salerno, halfway around the world on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Pork Chop Hill, the Chosin Reservoir, and in 100 rice paddies and jungles of a place called Vietnam. And this is where we actually, I think, got to for the previous segment where we talked about this speech. He says, under one such marker lies a young man, Martin Treptow, who left his job in a small-town barbershop in 1917 to go to France with the famed Rainbow Division. There on the Western Front, he was killed trying to carry a message between battalions under heavy artillery fire. We are told that on his body was found a diary. On the flyleaf under the heading My Pledge, he had written these words, America must win this war. Therefore, I will work. I will save. I will sacrifice. I will endure. I will fight cheerfully and do my utmost, as if the issue of the whole struggle depended on me alone. The crisis we are facing today, this is what Reagan then goes on to say, does not require of us the kind of sacrifice that Martin Treptow and so many thousands of others were called upon to make. It does require, however, our best effort, and our willingness to believe in ourselves and to believe in our capacity to perform great deeds, to believe that together, with God's help, we can and will resolve the problems which now confront us. And after all, why shouldn't we believe that? We are Americans. God bless you, and thank you. Again, even in that last segment where we discussed this, I said this is probably one of the few speeches that I get really emotional about because of the great sacrifices that have given us the opportunity to live in such a wonderful land. Sacrifices that we are grateful that are not required of us. But what is required of us is that we learn, we love, and we study these principles. We apply them to our lives and how we raise our children. We share them with those around us, and we live in that same in those same principles of holiness, of self-government and morality, sharing those same principles of freedom. Winston Churchill said, "We must never cease to proclaim in fearless tone the principles of freedom." Those principles of freedom proclaimed to our children, to our families, to our neighbors, to all those around us. And I ask you to continue to share those principles. A great way to share those principles would be sharing the Glorious Rescue and our content here. I'm always grateful for the subscriptions, subscribing, leaving us good ratings, reviews, all of that. And definitely the best way to help out the show is to continue to share our episodes and shows with others. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Josiah Evertson, and this is the Glorious Rescue.